Let's take a look at the problem here first. If I right click here with the DevTools open, I'll see this empty cache and hard reload. Let's try that. And we'll see this waterfall effect of everything that happens as the user comes onto our page. So I'm going to drag this over here so we can scope this down to just what's happening at the very start. And we'll see that the user goes to get the HTML, then they get some JavaScript and some CSS. And then as we drag this over, we're going to start seeing other requests being made here. So we'll see this me request right here to get some of the user data. And then later, after the me request is finished, we can start loading the code for the authenticated app. And then we can start loading the data for the list items for this user. And then we'll start loading the assets for each of those list items. So there's kind of a waterfall effect here that before we can get the list items, we need to know whether the user's logged in. Before we can start requesting that the user's logged in, we need to load all of the code for the app to actually trigger this request. But what if we can actually start loading the user before we even render any of our app? What if we can start loading the user as soon as our modules start loading, but before they've finished? If we can move this a little bit further, then we can start doing some of these other things a little bit earlier as well. So that's the idea here. And all that we need to do is take this getUser which is happening inside of this useEffect, which will only be run when this auth provider is mounted. So after the DOM has been updated, and let's just move it right up here. There's no information we need to give this function that the auth provider can provide before we can start loading this user. Remember, this function just calls into our auth provider to get the token. And if we have that token, then we'll call into our backend to get the user's information. And if that comes back, then we can return that user. But there's no reason we have to wait for our application to load before we execute this code. So by just moving this out and kicking it off as soon as possible, we can scrunch things over to the left a little bit. So let's try that again. We'll do a empty cache and a hard reload. And let's see. Here we're loading the user's data before we even start getting the favicon. Now it's kind of hard to tell the timings on all of this stuff, but just rest assured that this is actually happening before our component is mounted. And if you want to be totally certain of that, you can add a console log here, get user, and then we'll add a console log in here, use effect. And then we'll go to our console, get user happens before use effect. Now, because our application is pretty small, this may not be a huge benefit, but especially with a larger application, it could be pretty useful. And the general idea of just getting the data and assets that you need as soon as you have the information you need to get them will improve performance. So literally all that we did is we took this one line, which was called after the auth provider is mounted, and we moved it out of the auth provider entirely so that it's called at the same time the auth provider is defined, giving us a little bit of time to start getting the user's information when the app is loading.